Picture this. You're standing outside one of the most famous buildings in the world, watching silent figures in red coats and tall black hats. They don't move, they don't speak, they barely even blink. For decades, tourists have treated these royal guards like living statues, posing with them, touching them, even trying to make them laugh or react. But what happens when these highly trained soldiers, sworn to protect the British royal family, finally reach their breaking point? On a busy summer afternoon in London, millions of social media users were about to witness something that would change how the world views these iconic guardsmen forever. The videos would go viral within hours, sparking international debates about respect, duty, and human dignity. This isn't just another tourist mishap story. This is about the moment when tradition met modern disrespect, when protocol clashed with social media culture, and when the most disciplined soldiers in the world decided they'd had enough. What you're about to read actually happened, captured on dozens of phones and security cameras, witnessed by hundreds of shocked tourists, and reported by news outlets around the globe. The aftermath would lead to new rules, international discussions, and a completely different understanding of what it means to be a royal guard in the 21st century. Get ready for a story that will make you see those silent, red-coated figures in a completely new light. Picture this. You're standing outside one of the most famous buildings in the world, watching silent figures in red coats and tall black hats. They don't move, they don't speak, they barely even blink. For decades, tourists have treated these royal guards like living statues, posing with them, touching them, even trying to make them laugh or react. But what happens when these highly trained soldiers, sworn to protect the British royal family, finally reach their breaking point? On a busy summer afternoon in London, millions of social media users were about to witness something that would change how the world views these iconic guardsmen forever. The videos would go viral within hours, sparking international debates about respect, duty, and human dignity. This isn't just another tourist mishap story. This is about the moment when tradition met modern disrespect, when protocol clashed with social media culture, and when the most disciplined soldiers in the world decided they'd had enough. What you're about to read actually happened, captured on dozens of phones and security cameras, witnessed by hundreds of shocked tourists, and reported by news outlets around the globe. The aftermath would lead to new rules, international discussions, and a completely different understanding of what it means to be a royal guard in the 21st century. Get ready for a story that will make you see those silent, red-coated Judas in a completely new light. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mark Stevens stood inches from James's face, his breath reeking of alcohol and his eyes filled with the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from too many pints and too little sense. The crowd had gone silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. James could feel sweat dripping down his spine under his heavy wool uniform. His vision was starting to blur slightly from the heat and dehydration, but his training kept him focused. Look straight ahead, don't react. Maintain position. These were the 3 rules that had been drilled into him since day 1 of Royal Guard training. But Mark wasn't finished. He had travelled down from Manchester specifically for this bachelor party weekend, and his friends had dared him to break one of those toy soldiers. In his alcohol-fogged mind, this wasn't a real person he was harassing. It was just a tourist attraction that needed to be conquered. "I'm talking to you, mate," Mark said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "Don't you dare ignore me when I'm speaking to you." He reached out and poked James in the chest with his index finger, hard enough to be felt through the thick red tunic. The crowd gasped, and dozens of phone cameras focused in closer. This was crossing a line that even the most obnoxious tourists hadn't crossed. James felt the poke like an electric shock. Physical contact was absolutely forbidden. Not only was it disrespectful to the uniform and the institution, it was technically an assault on a member of the British Armed Forces. But still, his training held. Don't react. Don't move. Don't engage. Sarah Henderson, who had been live streaming for hours, felt her stomach drop as she watched through her phone screen. "Oh no, he just touched the guard," she whispered to her audience. "I don't think you're supposed to do that." Her viewer count had now climbed to over 8,000 people watching live, with comments flooding in from around the world. Most viewers were expressing shock and outrage at the behavior they were witnessing. David Chen, the travel blogger who had started this entire situation hours ago, suddenly realized that things had gone too far. What had begun as his attempt to get a better photo angle had spiraled into something ugly and potentially dangerous. But he was trapped in the crowd now, unable to push his way out, forced to watch as his initial provocation led to this moment. Mark poked James again, this time harder. "What are you, some kind of robot? Are you even alive in there?" That second poke was the spark that lit the fuse. James felt something snap inside him. A dam of restraint that had been building pressure for hours finally bursting his right hand, which had been gripping his rifle in a ceremonial position, began to tremble slightly. Tom Williams, the other guard positioned 20 feet away, caught the subtle movement immediately. In his 4 years of service, Tom had never seen James lose composure. If James was breaking, something serious was happening. The crowd had grown to over 700 people now, all pressed around the palace gates, like spectators at a boxing match. Word had spread across London through social media that something dramatic was happening at Buckingham Palace. People were arriving by the minute, pushing and shoving to get a better view. I said, "Are you alive in there?" Mark repeated, reaching out for a third poke. But this time, something was different. As Mark's finger approached James's chest, the guard's head snapped down to look directly at him. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that Mark actually stumbled backward, suddenly face to face with the intense stare of a combat veteran who had reached his absolute limit. The crowd fell completely silent. In 3 years of service, James had never broken the cardinal rule of Royal Guard duty. Never break character, never make eye contact with tourists. Never acknowledge their presence in any way. But now he was staring directly at Mark with an expression that made it very clear he was not a decorative statue or a tourist attraction. "Back away from me. Now." James's voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had been trained to kill if necessary. Every word was clear and measured, cutting through the summer air like a blade. Mark sobered up instantly. The alcohol-induced confidence evaporated as he found himself looking into the eyes of a real soldier who had clearly reached his breaking point. This wasn't a game anymore. I was just... Mark stammered, suddenly realizing that he had been harassing someone who could probably snap him in half without breaking a sweat. I said back away. James's voice was louder now, carrying across the courtyard. "You have 5 seconds to step back before I consider you a direct threat to royal security." The crowd began to murmur and shift nervously. This wasn't what they had come to see. They had wanted entertainment, a funny video to share on social media. They hadn't expected to witness a highly trained soldier reaching his breaking point. Sarah Henderson's live stream view account spiked to over 12,000 as word spread that something major was happening. Comments were flying by too fast to read, but the general sentiment was clear. People were shocked by both the tourists' behavior and the guards' response. Palace security had been monitoring the situation all afternoon, but they had held back, trusting in the guards' training to handle the crowd. Royal Guards were specifically chosen for their ability to maintain composure under pressure. But now, with James having broken protocol, everything changed. Captain Robert Morrison, the officer in charge of Royal Guard operations that day, received an urgent radio call from the security control room. "Sir, we have a situation at Gate 1. Guard Mitchell has engaged with tourists. Recommend immediate intervention." Morrison grabbed his radio and began jogging toward the main gates. In his 15 years of service, he had seen guards deal with everything from peaceful protesters to potential terrorist threats, but he had never seen one break character in front of tourists. Meanwhile, Mark had backed away as instructed, but the damage was done. The crowd's dynamic had completely changed. What had been playful harassment now felt dangerous and unpredictable. Parents began pulling their children closer, and some tourists started moving toward the exits. But not everyone was intimidated. Mark's bachelor party friends, who had been watching from nearby, decided their friend needed backup. 3 more drunk men pushed through the crowd toward James, all talking loudly and aggressively. "Who do you think you are, threatening our mate?" called out Danny Webb, Mark's best friend and the groom-to-be. "You're just a fancy doorman with a big hat. You can't threaten British citizens." Tom Williams, the other guard, found himself in an impossible position. His training said to maintain position no matter what. But his fellow guard was clearly in distress and potentially facing multiple threats. For the first time in his 4 years of service, Tom began to consider whether he might need to break protocol as well. James could see the 3 men approaching through his peripheral vision, but his eyes remained locked on Mark. His military training from Afghanistan was kicking in now, overriding his Royal Guard protocols. His mind was automatically calculating threats, exits, and responses. "Sir, I need you and your friends to leave this area immediately," James said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his military rank. "You have interfered with royal security operations and made physical contact with a member of Her Majesty's Guard. You are being recorded by multiple security cameras and could face criminal charges." This was completely true. The palace's security system had indeed recorded everything, and physical assault on a royal guard was a serious criminal offense that could result in significant jail time. But Mark and his friends were too drunk and too proud to back down now. Criminal charges? Danny laughed, emboldened by the crowd and the alcohol in his system. For what? Touching your pretty costume? You're not a real cop, mate. You can't arrest anyone. The crowd was getting restless now. Some people were trying to leave, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond entertainment into something potentially dangerous. But others were pressing closer, their phones recording every moment, hoping to capture whatever was about to happen next. Captain Morrison arrived just as Danny finished his taunt. He immediately assessed the situation. One guard out of position and engaged with tourists, another guard showing signs of stress, a crowd of over 700 people, multiple drunk and aggressive individuals, and dozens of cameras recording everything for social media. Guardsman Mitchell, return to position, Morrison commanded in a voice that cut through the crowd noise like a gunshot. James heard his captain's order, but he was no longer thinking like a ceremonial guard. His combat training had taken over, and he was focused on the immediate threats in front of him. Mark and his three friends were still advancing. The crowd was pressing closer from all sides, and he was beginning to feel trapped. I said return to position, guardsman, Morrison repeated, now standing at the edge of the crowd. But it was too late. Danny Webb, emboldened by what he saw as the guard's defiance of his own officer, decided to escalate further. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video, speaking directly to the camera while standing just inches from James. So here we are at Buckingham Palace, where the famous royal guards are having a complete meltdown, Danny announced to his phone. This guy just threatened to arrest British citizens for the crime of tourism. What a complete joke these people are. As he spoke, Danny deliberately stepped even closer to James, invading his personal space while continuing to film. The guard could smell the alcohol on his breath and could see the mocking expression in his eyes. Something inside James snapped completely. Get away from me, now! James shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls and silencing the entire crowd. The sound was so sudden and so loud that several people screamed in surprise. But James wasn't finished. 3 years of maintaining perfect composure while being harassed, mocked, and disrespected came pouring out all at once. I am a soldier in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, he continued, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard. I have served my country in combat, and I will not be disrespected by drunken tourists who think my uniform makes me their personal entertainment. The crowd was stunned into complete silence. Many people had never heard a royal guard speak at all, let alone shout. Children were crying, tourists were backing away, and phones were capturing every moment of this unprecedented breakdown of centuries of protocol. Tom Williams made his decision. Seeing his fellow guard in distress and facing multiple threats, he stepped away from his own post and began moving toward James's position. This meant that both guards were now out of position, something that had never happened in the modern history of the Royal Guards. Captain Morrison was speaking urgently into his radio, calling for immediate backup and crowd control. This situation was spiraling out of control, and he needed more personnel immediately. Danny Webb, still recording on his phone, was too drunk to understand the seriousness of what was happening. Instead of backing away, he laughed at James's outburst and continued filming. Oh, look everyone, the toy soldier is having a tantrum, he announced to his phone camera. Maybe if you can't handle tourists, you should get a different job, mate. That was the final straw. James took one step forward, bringing him face to face with Danny, and spoke in a voice that every combat veteran would recognize, the voice of someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and was now ready to fight. Last warning. Step back, put the camera away, and leave this area now, or I will physically remove you myself. The threat was clear, immediate, and real. Danny finally sobered up enough to realize that he was no longer dealing with a ceremonial guard who couldn't react. He was facing a trained soldier who was clearly prepared to back up his words with action. But the damage was done. Videos of James's outburst were already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. Within minutes, hashtags like #RoyalGuardMeltdown and #Buckingham Palace Incident were trending globally. News outlets were picking up the story. Tourists were sharing their own footage, and the British government was about to face an international incident over tourist behaviour at one of their most important landmarks. As Captain Morrison finally reached James's position, accompanied by palace security officers, he realised that this single incident was about to change everything about how the Royal Guards operated. The age of social media had collided head-on with centuries of tradition, and nothing would ever be the same. Within 30 minutes of James's outburst, The video had been viewed over 100,000 times across multiple social media platforms. Sarah Henderson's live stream alone had reached 15,000 concurrent viewers, and the recorded clips were being shared faster than anyone could track. The hashtag #RoyalGuard meltdown was trending in 12 countries, and news organizations from around the world were scrambling to get their reporters to Buckingham Palace. Captain Morrison, accompanied by 4 palace security officers, had successfully dispersed the immediate crowd around the guards. Mark Stevens and his bachelor party friends had been escorted away by police for questioning, though they would later be released with warnings and lifetime bans from all royal properties. But the real crisis was just beginning. James Mitchell sat in a small office inside the palace, still wearing his red tunic, but with his bearskin hat placed carefully on the desk beside him. His hands were shaking slightly, partly from adrenaline and partly from the realization of what he had done. In 3 years of exemplary service, he had never even spoken while on duty, and now he had shouted at tourists in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. "Guardsman Mitchell," Captain Morrison said as he entered the room, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there." James straightened in his chair, falling back on his military training. "Sir, I lost composure under extreme provocation. The tourist made repeated physical contact despite warnings, and I felt that the situation was escalating to a potential security threat." Morrison nodded, making notes on a pad. He had watched the security footage and seen the hours of harassment that led up to James's outburst. While the guards' response was unprecedented and violated protocol, Morrison understood why it had happened. "Sir," James continued, his voice quiet but steady, "I take full responsibility for my actions. I know I've violated my oath and disgraced the regiment. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences are deemed appropriate. But outside that small office, the consequences were already spiraling far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The British media had picked up the story within the hour, with headlines ranging from "Royal Guard loses it at Buckingham Palace" to "Tourist harassment goes too far." The footage was playing on loop on every major news channel. The international reaction was swift and divided. American news outlets generally supported the Guard, with one commentator saying, "These men are soldiers, not theme park attractions." The tourists' behavior was absolutely disgraceful. German media focused on the growing problem of tourist entitlement at historical sites worldwide. But British media was more critical, questioning whether the Royal Guards were properly trained to handle modern tourism pressures. Social media reactions were equally polarized, but overwhelmingly supportive of James. Comments poured in from military veterans around the world, many sharing their own stories of being treated as objects rather than people while in uniform. The hashtag #RespectOurGuards began trending as a counter-movement, with thousands of people sharing messages of support for the Royal Guards. Meanwhile, Tom Williams faced his own consequences for leaving his post to support his fellow Guard. While he hadn't shouted or threatened anyone, abandoning his position was equally serious in military terms. He sat in an adjacent office waiting for his own interview with Captain Morrison. The palace's public relations team was in full crisis mode. Within 2 hours of the incident, they had received calls from over 50 international news organizations requesting comments. Tourist groups were demanding explanations, military officials were calling emergency meetings, and government ministers were being briefed on what the media was already calling the Buckingham Palace incident. Sir Charles Whitmore, the palace's chief communications officer, found himself facing the most challenging public relations crisis of his career. The royal family's image was built on tradition, dignity, and unwavering professionalism. Having one of their guards lose control in front of international media threatened all of that. "We need to control this narrative immediately," Whitmore told his team during an emergency meeting. "The question is whether we support the Guards' actions or condemn them. Either choice has significant implications." The debate wasn't just happening in palace offices. Online forums exploded with discussions about tourist behavior, military respect, and the pressures faced by ceremonial guards. Reddit threads with titles like "Royal Guard finally snaps," "Hero or disgrace," generated thousands of comments from people around the world, sharing their own experiences with entitled tourists. David Chin, the travel blogger whose demands for better photo positioning had started the entire chain of events, found himself at the center of an internet firestorm. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages from people who had seen the videos and blamed him for the harassment. Within hours, he had lost over 10,000 followers and received thousands of critical comments. "I never meant for any of this to happen," David posted on his Instagram account. "I was just trying to get a good photo. I had no idea it would lead to all this chaos." "I feel terrible about what happened to that guard." But his apology was too little, too late. Screenshots of his earlier posts, where he had called the guards stupid and unprofessional, were being shared widely as examples of tourist entitlement. Travel bloggers and influencers around the world began distancing themselves from his behaviour. The British government was forced to respond quickly. By evening, the Secretary of State for Defence had issued a statement. "The brave men and women who serve as royal guards deserve our respect and protection." While we expect the highest standards of professionalism from our military personnel, we also expect visitors to our nation's landmarks to behave with appropriate dignity and respect. This carefully worded statement was interpreted by many as tacit support for James's actions, though it stopped short of explicitly endorsing his response. Behind the scenes, military officials were debating whether disciplinary action was appropriate or whether James had acted reasonably under extreme circumstances. The incident had also sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of people in ceremonial roles around the world. Stories emerged from other countries about similar problems faced by guards at famous landmarks. The Greek guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Athens had experienced similar harassment. Honor guards at Arlington National Cemetery had dealt with disrespectful tourists. The changing of the guard at various European palaces had become circuses of phone cameras and inappropriate behaviour. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor of tourism studies at Oxford University, appeared on the BBC that evening to discuss the incident. "What we're seeing is the collision of traditional protocol with modern tourist behaviour," she explained. "Social media has created an expectation that everything and everyone is available for content creation. These guards are human beings doing a serious job, but tourists increasingly treat them as props for their vacation photos." The palace had to make some immediate practical decisions. Should the guards continue their normal duties while the story was dominating international news? Should they change protocols to prevent similar incidents? Should they station more security officers near the guards to manage crowds? Captain Morrison spent the evening reviewing security footage from multiple angles, trying to piece together exactly how the situation had escalated. What he saw was a gradual build-up of pressure over several hours, with dozens of tourists contributing to an increasingly hostile environment. James hadn't just snapped randomly. He had endured hours of systematic harassment before reaching his breaking point. The footage also revealed something else interesting. While most tourists had behaved inappropriately, several had tried to defend the guards or discourage the harassment. Sarah Henderson's live-stream comments showed many viewers expressing disgust at the tourists' behaviour even before James's outburst. A few tourists had actually tried to tell others to leave the guards alone, though they had been ignored. By midnight, the story had gone truly global. News outlets in Asia, Australia, the Americas, and across Europe had picked it up. Late-night television hosts in the United States were already preparing jokes about British politeness finally reaching its limit. International travel websites were adding warnings about appropriate behaviour around royal guards. The tourism industry was taking notice too. London's Visitor Bureau was concerned about the negative publicity, but they were also fielding inquiries from tourists asking about respectful ways to view the guards. Many people seemed genuinely unaware that the guards were active-duty soldiers with real security responsibilities. Travel agencies began updating their information packages for London tours. Previously, guides had often encouraged tourists to try to get reactions from the guards, treating it as harmless fun. Now, they were emphasizing that the guards were working military personnel who deserve professional respect. The reaction from military communities worldwide was overwhelmingly supportive. Veterans organizations issued statements backing James's response, with many former soldiers sharing their own stories of being treated as entertainment rather than people while in uniform. "This young man showed remarkable restraint for as long as he did," said Colonel James Harrison, a retired British Army officer, in an interview with Sky News. "In my opinion, he acted with appropriate force when faced with escalating harassment and physical assault. Any criticism of his response is completely unfounded." But not everyone agreed. Some commentators argued that ceremonial guards should be prepared for any level of tourist behaviour, and that James's response was unprofessional regardless of the provocation. A few suggested that if the guards couldn't handle tourist attention, perhaps the traditional ceremonies needed to be modified or moved away from public areas. The palace staff worked through the night to prepare for the media storm that would continue the next day. They knew that James's future, the reputation of the royal guards, and possibly the future of public ceremonial duties, all hung in the balance. In his small quarters that night, James Mitchell lay awake staring at the ceiling. He had joined the military to serve his country, had survived combat tours, and had taken pride in upholding centuries of tradition as a royal guard. Now, in a matter of minutes, all of that was in question. But he also thought about the tourists who had spent hours treating him like an object, who had seen his uniform and decided that meant he wasn't fully human. He thought about Mark Stevens' finger jabbing into his chest, about Danny Webb's mocking laughter, about David Chen's demands that he move for a better photo angle. For the first time in 3 years, James wondered if the traditional silence of the Royal Guards was really the right approach in an age when anyone with a phone could broadcast live to thousands of viewers around the world. The next morning would bring investigations, meetings, and decisions that would change how the Royal Guards operated. The age of social media had forced a collision with centuries of tradition, and the aftermath was still being written. Within a week, new protocols would be implemented. Additional security personnel would be stationed near all Royal Guards. Clear barriers would be installed to prevent physical contact. Signs would be posted explaining the Guards' role and demanding respectful behaviour. Tourist behaviour that constituted harassment would result in immediate removal from royal properties. But perhaps most importantly, the incident had started a global conversation about respect, dignity, and the human cost of treating people as tourist attractions. James Mitchell's moment of lost control had become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. The videos would eventually be viewed millions of times worldwide. They would be studied in military academies as examples of pressure breaking points. They would be used in tourism industry training as cautionary tales about visitor behaviour, and they would stand as a reminder that behind every uniform, every ceremony, and every tradition, there are real people deserving of basic human respect. 6 months later, James would be quietly commended for his years of service and transferred to a position away from public duties at his own request. The incident would become part of Royal Guard training, not as an example of what not to do, but as a case study in recognizing when situations are escalating beyond acceptable limits. The tourists who harassed him would find themselves banned from royal properties for life. Their behavior preserved forever on the internet as an example of how not to treat the people who dedicate their lives to serving their country and preserving traditions that have stood for centuries. And the world would be reminded that respect is not optional, tradition is not entertainment, and soldiers are not tourist attractions, no matter how colorful their uniforms or how still they stand.